What we're going to talk about today, oh, there we go. Thank you very much. A little bit of background on us. Where do I point it to? Up there? Gotcha. A little bit of background about us, who we are, our experience with groups, and I'm going to talk a lot about premium development methodologies. And then we're going to get into a number of issues and concerns. If you have questions that come up, please feel free. We want this to be as interactive as possible. Okay. Come on. There we go. Back. There we go. I am the managing principal at Pinnacle. I've been in the group captive business for over 30 years, and I've been coming down here to Cayman for over 25. We work, our firm works with somewhere in the neighborhood about 6 group captives, and because we've been doing this for a lot of years, we feel pretty comfortable talking about it. Jim, if you could say a couple words about yourself.
Yeah, my name's Jim DeWolf. I'm with Captive Resources. I've been with the company 17 years, chose 18 here because I was working in captives prior to coming to Captive Resources. My role is I manage one heterogeneous program that's over 100 million, and I manage what they call a homogeneous captive, which is for transportation, that's right over 45 million.
So we deal with a lot of the group captives managed by Kensington and Captive Resources, but with 5 other providers as well. So this common methodology that we're going to be talking about has been used for a lot of years and has proved its worth over a long period of time. And it relates both, interestingly, to both homogeneous and heterogeneous captives, both large and small. Okay. There we go. Okay, how does one get started? Well, almost always, we're working with information provided by a broker, and it's organized into an underwriting submission, and there's lots of information that we need. I don't necessarily want to spend a lot of time, but any actuary that's going to be reviewing a body of data usually wants 4 pieces of information: premiums, losses, claim counts, and exposure. And in an underwriting submission, we want some detail. Obviously, we want a breakout by year for the losses. We want it by line of coverage. We want to know about large losses. We want to know about a fair amount of information about the exposure. Where do they operate? What's the nature of their business? Where is their payroll? What kind of a look at their payroll by class gives us a pretty good idea of the nature of their underlying business. What is the nature of their auto liability exposure? Is it long haul? Is it artisan contractors? Is it private passenger types? Is it buses? Is it a mix of all those things? We spend quite a bit of time before we even get started making sure we understand the nature of the underlying business that we're looking at. And then just as importantly, besides the historical exposure, we want a pretty good faith estimate of next year's exposure, and we'll see why that's so important. I already talked about large claim information, but qualitative information that can be provided in the submission is every bit, if not more important than the quantitative data. And in particular, not only the locations, but if the company is operating as a number of separate independent divisions. I've seen submissions that are about yay thick because the company may operate from 18 different divisions. Maybe they have, no, okay, I'm exaggerating. Let's say 3 independent divisions, 3 separate insurance programs. We're trying to develop a unified loss projection. And sometimes the coverages being provided here versus there may be very different. Maybe you've got garage exposure over here and you've got artisan contractors over here. And in trying to make some sense of what to expect for next year's costs within the captive, we may do 3 separate loss projections and add them together. It all really depends upon what's going on. And that last bullet point here, and let's see if I get the pointer right. There we go. Significant operational changes. By operational changes, that can mean all kinds of things. New management, maybe hiring a safety director. Maybe it relates to selling a division or purchasing a new company. Lots of what I'll call real world type stuff that we have to factor into what it is we're looking at, because the actuarial process starts with the numbers And all of these things, the qualitative information, can have a very significant bearing on our conclusions. So let's talk about this. There really are two ways that actuaries are going to look at trying to develop some funding estimates or some premium development. Number one, experience rating. Number two, exposure rating. Experience rating is what it is. We're going to look at the actual claims experience and rely upon that as much as possible in trying to predict next year's losses. An exposure rating approach, however, is one more where you take and you develop your premiums or loss funds based on manual rates, all right, broad industry averages. For virtually every of the group captives that I'm working with, we use the former, an experience rating approach, because that's fundamental to the nature of the captive itself, the concept, and so on and so on. We're going to talk about that in some detail. Now, the experience rating approach has some limitations, as you can imagine. Occasionally we get presented with a loss-free account. Well, how can you experience rate that? Can you? Well, I would submit to you, yes, you can. And we're going to show you how we go about that. But more interestingly, the experience rating approach, our focus for most of our captives is that we want to experience rate a frequency layer of coverage. Let's just use, for the sake of today, $100,000, a frequency layer. Because we know that claims that are less on average, the more frequent claims are going to be easier to predict because we've got more data to work with. If I'm trying to predict high-level excess like we had in the prior session with these medical malpractice claims, an experience rating approach isn't the ideal way to go about it. You've got very few claims, they're infrequent, they're here and there. We're going to focus on the primary frequency layer of loss. And in this experience rating approach, we're going to presume that the claims experience is fully reliable for projecting next year's costs. And I've had many arguments with fronting carriers, reinsurers, even other actuaries. You're nuts, you can't do that. Well, yes we can, and we've been doing it for 30 years, and the proof is in the pudding. Now consider claims experience being reliable for projecting next year's costs. There are many situations where we do have loss-free years or a coverage that has loss-free. You've only got maybe no claims in X number of years. One of the questions we almost always start from is, okay, if you're going to use experience rating, how much data do you use? Now, if it's a classic actuarial problem. Do you want a stable method that produces a similar answer year to year to year, which would argue for using maybe 10 years of claim history? Or do you want a method that's very responsive to the claims experience? That argues for a shorter claims experience. In our view, working with groups like this, we think the sweet spot is somewhere between 5 and 6 years of historical data. We think that between looking at the look-back period of 5 to 6 years is a good balance between a method that's both stable and responsive. And I would submit to you that there's more of an emphasis with these groups on having methods that are responsive. And there are occasions when they are very responsive. And I give the speech all the time that if you've got a responsive method, that's a double-edged sword. If you want your latest experience to be, built into next year's premium projections because you had a great year last year, fine, but you better prepared. If next year, if you have a stinker of a year, you're going to be paying for it over a 5-year period, and Jim will get into some of that a little bit later. So the experience rating approach is fundamental, and I talked about the frequency versus the severity layer. Typically, the frequency layer is going to be dependent upon each individual member's experience. The severity layer for the captive typically will examine expected costs in that severity layer. Let's, for the sake of this discussion today, say that the severity layer is 300x of 100. Maybe the captive has a $400,000 retention. Frequency layer is the first 100. The severity layer is 300x of 100. In our approach, we have found that using the aggregate experience for all members combined in the group to develop an expected cost in the severity layer that is a percentage of the expected costs in the frequency layer works very well, not only from a mathematical point of view, but because these group captives, they're designed in such a way that you want to attract members that take a long view of the world and not in one year and out the next. And if you want to attract businesses that are all about safety, loss control, and risk management, their ability to join the group and control their costs in the frequency layer has a beneficial impact in the severity layer as well, because it's stated as a percentage of the frequency. And oh, by the way, on operating costs as well. And again, I don't want to steal Jim's thunder, but that approach has worked very, very well. Any questions so far? Yes.
Between bullet point numbers, bullet point 3 and 4 on the left, what happens if, let's say you were using your numbers 100 and the 300 excess. Let's say that one day you say, you know what, we're tired of all the noise because of these claims that come in 100. So you increase that 100 to say 300 to get rid of the noise. Then all of a sudden, your frequency that is driving your individual member experience is essentially gone, because now your severity layer is much higher. So I'm trying to get a feel for what do you do in a case where you increase the retention and that takes out the noise, so you're just stuck with a lot more severe things.
You want to take?
Yeah, I mean, when you look at that, you're looking at that 100 layer. So first of all, you have to look at why these group captives get put together and the types of coverages we're looking at: workers' comp, GL, and auto. So generally what we're looking at there is somebody who's more frequency based. So you would generally not see somebody go from 100 to 300 for what we would call your frequency layer. You might see a lot of our captives at Captive Resources started out at 75,000. And then with inflation and different things like that, we determined that 75,000 was actually 100,000. And some of our captives have gone up to 125 and 150. But that severity layer, you also have an aspect there that you have to have what they call risk sharing, right? So what you're talking about is if I raise it to 300,000 and I eliminate that, I eliminate some of the tax deductibility and some of the different pieces of being considered a quote group captive, right? There's got to be that level of sharing amongst people. So we have to look at that, and we come to Joe, and he's got some really articulate ways to say that and some really cool words, and I don't even know what you call it, the 10-10 rule and this, that rule. But the bottom line is, if you don't have that risk-sharing level, you've kind of eliminated some of the concept. But really, the guys that are coming into these types of group deals right now, unlike the other presentation for the professional where it's a $2 million and a $3 million claim, they're saying on average, 1 out of 5 years, I'm going to have all these little claims over here. I might get one blip, and I'm okay with that. And that's kind of, so when you think about it, it's also the types of risk we're looking to put into the group, which means they're generally running in that 0 to 100,000 range.
And we're going to get into some real world type problems and concerns and issues in a little bit, but I want to go through the mechanics of it first. So the approach that we take is pretty simple. We rely upon 5 to 6 years of data. We necessarily have to incorporate benchmarks to, in effect, take the current snapshot of the claims experience and massage it to reflect IBNR, because we know that the claims that are on a loss run today will grow in size before they reach their ultimate values. And we know that the claims today will cost a different amount, especially for workers' compensation, because of jurisdictions that they're in and the statutory changes in benefit levels that every jurisdiction makes. And we know that the claims are going to go up in cost as a general rule with trend or inflation. So we make at least those 3 adjustments to take the current snapshot of the claims. Actually, we take the current snapshot of the claims, we slice off anything above 100,000 per claim. We keep the first 100 in there. We slice off the rest, set that aside because we're focused on the frequency layer. And then we incorporate benchmarks for expected loss ratios, loss development patterns, trend, and benefit levels. Now, why would we use an expected loss ratio? Well, if we have a loss-free account, typically we're going to be relying upon a premium-based method to get at some semblance of an expected ultimate loss, even though the current snapshot says there are 0. And the very simple reason for that is if you have a loss-free account, I don't think it's reasonable to presume that for funding purposes that their funding next year should be 0. So it's necessary to incorporate these benchmarks, and we have a vast library of these benchmarks for different classes of risks, different jurisdictions. We keep track of the work comp, loss development patterns state by state, even layer by layer. And on much of these benchmarks, we try to customize to the nature of the risks underlying operations. And when we're doing it at renewal, and we're going to get to this in a minute, but after a member is in the captive and we're doing a renewal loss pick, in effect updating the original loss pick, we will use a cap, a circuit breaker, if you will, to limit the change in the frequency layer loss cost per unit exposure, simply because our methods are very responsive. Question out here.
Would you factor in the return you expect on the captive or profit margin?
Jim, that one's yours.
Perfect, thank you. No, well, obviously, we run financials, so that is in there. So there's a number of different factors, but what we're going to originally do is we're going to come up with what we think your appropriate funding needs to be. And then ultimately, as we start to do the investments, and we can talk a little bit about that, we do the investments, it's kind of more on an individual basis, on how claims are paid out, how quickly claims are paid out by the individual members in that captive. So the investment piece is more outside of his realm. We use your losses, figure your losses out, because remember, when he does the loss pick, the other thing to keep in mind, if we use this group as a captive, each one of you is getting an individual loss pick. Okay, so it's not like this big group gets a loss pick, he sends it to us, and we just kind of willy-nilly send it out to everybody. Each person's losses is developing what their pick needs to be. So from an investment standpoint, it really wouldn't make sense to say, well, might be what your return would be on that.
Okay, now lots of things can come into play. We talked about some of the operational changes, but I want to focus on new management just for a moment. If we've had a family-run business and things have been done a certain way forever and ever and ever, and they sell out, and new management comes in, if that new management doesn't have the same commitment to safety, loss control, and risk management, I've seen it, I don't know how many times, Andy, you probably have as well, that claims experience can head south so fast, you wouldn't believe it. Management and their commitment to safety is paramount in these. And I find it interesting as well. Sometimes, as part of the underwriting submission, we'll get a safety manual. And I would submit to you, my rule of thumb, is the size of the safety manual is inversely related to its effectiveness. If you've got a safety manual with a single page of paper, but it's communicated from the very top of the organization throughout, all the way down to the shop room floor, that's going to probably be more effective. In any case, when we hear about, well, we did this, this, and this, I always ask, I raise my hand and I say, okay, let's talk about that. Excuse me. When did you do it? Help me understand the nature of the change, and excuse me, maybe we'll see it in the data. The one that I love, oh, that's on the next slide, sorry. Safety Director, Risk Management. Acquisitions or divestitures. If something's happened in that 5 or 6 year period that we're reviewing, let's say they sold off a division, we want the data, the premiums, the losses, the exposure data from that sold division out of there. Likewise, if they've acquired a new division, we want the historical 5 or 6 years of data on that division so we can incorporate it, because we're trying to predict next year's claims. In a submission, we're always dealing sometimes with incomplete data, missing data. This is always a challenging one. Overlapping policy periods. I mentioned the multiple division problems. Underlying deductibles and retentions. We're always presuming that we're getting first dollar losses, first dollar premium, but lots of times you can tell it's not. We raise our hand, come back to these guys, they go back to the broker. What's the deal? Have they got a retention? Have they got, oh yeah, we didn't tell you? Yeah, they got a deductible. Okay, maybe if we got the deductible experience, let's put that in. Interestingly, a lot of times we get this question, well, what about recoveries? Oh, this guy, he's got a claim that's being subrogated. They're gonna retrieve back $100,000. And I grew up in Missouri, the Show Me State, and our rule of thumb is that, you know, you're probably right, they're probably gonna subrogate and get that back, but we don't reflect it until the cash is received, period. And many lively discussions about that. Sometimes unusual coverages come into play, be it liquor, inland marine, sometimes within the captive template, a lot of times outside. or limited coverage that present challenges as well.
Go back
Okay.
one slide real quick.
Yeah.
The other thing in the acquisitions and divestitures that we see that gets interesting is, let's use a construction company, right? So you have a construction company that's just doing very basic construction, then decides to buy a scaffolding company, or somebody that does something at extreme heights. Obviously, your exposure basis has changed dramatically. So obviously, if I jettison that, we should get rid of that because that helps the loss pick, right? It's a less exposure because I don't have guys 30 feet off the air. But if all of a sudden I buy somebody and I double my company, we go to that. We want Joe to figure that out. Because again, the one thing going back to your question, there's risk sharing going on in here. So we also want to make sure when we're putting this out, he's got enough information to be putting a good projection out of what those losses are going to be. So we avoid having this massive run of risk sharing because we didn't project or predict what it was going to be.
Okay, a few other considerations. Credibility from an actuarial point of view is very simple. How much do you believe the data? Well, in the frequency layer, we're starting with an operating assumption that we believe it 100%. This is the one that I love, the impact of large individual claims. We hear it from the brokers, we hear it from the members, we hear it from CRI, we hear it from everybody. And the whole point is, look, you can't hold that claim against me because that employee's no longer with us, or we've done something and you can't hold it against us. It'll never happen again. And my response is always the same. You know, you're probably right. It probably will not happen again. But let's go back over 5 years, and I'm sure that in 2 or 3 of those years, you can point to an individual claim every year, and you've addressed it, and it'll never happen again. Yeah, you can't hold that against us. My point is, well, in the next 3 to 5 years, you'll be able to look back in retrospect and say, that was an unusual claim, that'll never happen again. My point is, you gotta fund for it. You cannot ignore it. Now, sometimes there are claims that are so unusual or outside the captive template that it does require special consideration. But I am typically not swayed very much when I get the argument, oh, you can't hold that against us. That'll never happen again.
But Joe, do you hold it against that member of the captive, or do you take the consideration of that large claim and spread it across the group?
Both. The member that caused it goes in, the first 100,000 goes into their loss pick. Anything above 100 is the responsibility of the captive.
I think the only uniqueness you see is if you find something where there's a claim and that claim was for an innocuous coverage that you're no longer putting into the captive. Some people say we'll strip it out. It's very hard sometimes, so we might ask Joe to discount it or whatever, but the example we use is uninsured motorist. If I have a cap on uninsured motorist and you get whacked with $1 million claim, but in the captive, maybe we limit you to 200 grand, those are things Joe's gonna look at also to try to determine whether it's, you know, like he said, credibility and consistency.
We used to include pollution coverage in our policy. We don't.
Good job. We don't want those.
We never had a claim that
And
recognize that's not our area.
I work with a company that insures underground storage tanks, and they offer pollution coverage, but at very low limits, and that's how they manage their claims. And they're in a risk retention group, not a captive. Okay, some of the actuarial issues, I've already touched on some of these. Let me talk about trend. Trend is an interesting concept, and it's not just inflation. When we're applying a trend factor in our loss cost projection model, that trend really reflects 3 things. Trends in average claim severities, which almost always are going to trend up with inflation. Trends in claim frequencies, and trends in payroll. Trends in exposure. Because the loss cost, if you think about the math of a loss cost, it's frequency times severity divided by exposure. And that trend rate in payroll can be very significant. Typically, we use about a 4% trend rate. But with certain economic conditions, it can be higher or lower. Likewise, trends in average claim severities and claim frequencies have been very, very dynamic recently. And just for your benefit, in our model, we use +1 for workers' compensation. And we have been for about 10 years. Because over the last 10 years, claim frequency for workers' comp has been going down, 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 down. It's bottomed out and is heading back up. But interestingly, average claim severities for workers' compensation have been trending up at a very low rate for about the last 4 years. And payrolls being what they are, but typically we're gonna use +5 for auto, plus 5 for general liability, but +1 for workers' compensation. And remember, that's frequency, severity, and the trend in exposure. Lots of other things that come into play. I think.
Go back one question, one thing real quick.
Yeah.
On that changes in statutory benefit levels, it's kind of a unique thing. You look at Florida, they had their litigation change there where they were talking, it added 19 billion in IBNR to the state. You look at California, who it seems like every year is changing their minimum wages. So remember, that has a big impact to them if you write a lot of California business. So to your question, those individual members are obviously seeing trend factor developments. So if, you know, you had an $8 minimum wage and it goes to 12, you still have to adjust that historical losses because it's going to impact it from a long-term basis. So it's really interesting watching these different states do all these different pieces and then arguing with Joe while we were like, oh, no, that doesn't work that way anymore. And he's like,
Yeah,
well,
this-
this just happened.
The
And
state
so,
of Florida has been a whipsaw because the Castellanos decision, a Supreme Court decision, in effect, did away with limitations on lawyer fees.
Yep, on legal.
And we have to necessarily rely upon the professionals to gauge the impact of laws. So in the case of workers' compensation, we rely upon the NCCI. Their estimate right out of the box is that the Castellanos decision was plus 20% in total costs, plus 20. Plus 20, just because of a court decision. We reflected that in our loss picks. And then they came back the next year. Oh, sorry, the NCCI did. It's only plus 10. And so that affects the rates that are being charged and so on and so on. And we understand that that can be very problematic, but we're not going to try and second guess the NCCI on how they go about doing their calculations. But now, in retrospect, we've watered that down to just plus 10. But do we have a question on that? Yes.
Not on that.
Sure, sure.
Yeah.
On this slide.
Sure.
Can you address the discontinued versus ongoing operations?
Excuse me, yeah, that's not unlike the sale of a division or
You're going to strip that data out?
Yes.
typically, if it's no longer around, if it's not going to be around next year within the captive template.
But you need to be able to tell us in that situation, you're going to look at what are the exact claims and the exact exposure. So sometimes the challenge for companies is everything's globalized together, and you say, okay, well, how much was the exposure? And they're like, well, we think it's this. Well, which ones are the claims? And they have commingling of employees. It's very hard to say, well, that claim happened over here or happened over there. But
me
if you
give
have
you
a true division, you know, and you say we're jettisoning or we're just not going to do that anymore, it's easy to strip that data out to come up with what your predictability would be going forward.
Let me give you another example. We have a group captive that is motor coach operators. Don't call them buses, they're motor coaches. But one of the members had a significant change in their operations, and they were going to go away from motor coaches to school buses. And we had quite a bit of discussion about the significant difference in exposure between a school bus and a motor coach. And we were able to make some corresponding direct adjustments in the calculation of that expected cost. So that's an example of some of the things that we might do. Okay, I want to keep going, and give Jim plenty of time, but at renewal, I talked about the fact that we're going to, at renewal, develop a new frequency layer loss cost for each individual member of the captive. So we redo the loss picks for everybody. We're going to limit the change in that frequency layer loss cost from the prior year. Typically, the cap is plus or minus 25%, because this method that we use can be very responsive. And in many instances, we're going to apply a minimum loss cost, either for general liability or for auto. I mean, if we go through our thing and we develop an auto liability loss cost of $15, hello, okay, that doesn't make a lot of sense. So we incorporate a minimum. And we talked about looking at the aggregate experience for all the members of the group as a whole to develop that severity layer cost. Now, there are times, especially with a heterogeneous captive, that when we look, let's just say we have 100 members, and when you look at the claims experience for 3 or 4 members that have lots and lots of claims in that severity layer, so maybe they've got I don't know, maybe 10 claims above $100,000 in the last 5 years. We will sometimes consider working with CRI and the captive, using a different severity fund percentage for that, for lack of a better phrase, high severity group. Now, typically in doing that, we want to be sure that it's not one of these things where they're in this year and out the next. We're looking that they have a significant number in that layer, and that if we were to look at their claims experience by themselves, is significantly different from the rest to justify a change. And then because the way we go about this is we develop loss costs member by member and add them up. It's a very granular approach. When the renewal is done, we do some top-down tests of reasonableness, because we know that the fronting carriers and the reinsurers are certainly looking at it as a group as a whole, rather than as a collection of individuals. We apply some tests of reasonableness to be sure that we're not out to lunch. Okay? So Jim, you've got some comments.
Sure. So as you look at this slide, and again, we look at your renewal adjustments and prospects. This is actually the last slide, so I don't need to play with the little toy. We look at it in two fashions. If you look at the right side, obviously prospects, somebody comes to us and looks at it and says, here's what we need. They give us all the data, we send it over to Joe. The first thing we do is, you saw a couple slides back, he used the word judgment, right? Judgment. So if you start to go through an actuary, what you're going to first look to see is there an anomaly in what the loss history is? An example being $10,000, $15,000, $12,000, $220,000, $15,000. That 1 year could put an extreme strain on the actuarial basis, because it's so heavily weighted based on how big those claims were. So we may look to Joe first and say, statistically that looks like an anomaly. You got 1 year, everything else looks really good. There's some stories behind the claim. What do you look at for here? And Joe's going to turn around and look at that. He's going to say, well, we might weigh this. And as Joe said, he may come back and say, no, I'm not going to weigh that, because there's some different aspects here. So as we see this and say, estimate future renewal to avoid material increases or decreases of prospect. When we look at these types of actuarials and we see it, the other thing you don't want is somebody to come in, pay $500,000 1 year, $300,000 the next year, $400,000 with no real exposure change. So what we may do is go back to AIG and say, look, we would like you to give us a weight or give us some consideration on this, so we can try to flatten this out a little bit so you don't have a member bouncing up and down. When we look at larger accounts, if we bring an account in, some people say in group captives you can't look at an account unless it's $1 million, or you can't look at an account unless it's $5 million. We've got accounts at Captive Resources that are over $25 million in our group programs. Though if I have a $25 million or a $10 million account, likely I'm going to come to Joe and say, I need you to develop the loss cost and everything more specific to them, and because of their size, we can get a true frequency and severity loss cost specific to them, not necessarily using exactly the industry averages or the captive averages. So again, on the larger accounts, we may come to him and look at a little bit of a different methodology. When you look at the unusual terms and conditions, in our captives, we all have what we call a coverage template. If you see somebody, you brought up the pollution, that example. You might have somebody who needs a pollution endorsement based on some contract. They really don't have the exposure, so are you really going to get too nasty on that? You look at a lot of the contractors, what are they doing? So what we may do is we may look at that and say, with this type of adding this endorsement or whatever, we may have to go back to AIG and say, okay, what do you want to add to the risk? Because this is a little bit outside of the norm. So they may put a factor based on that into the cost of what the captive needs to have for funding based on what those endorsements could be. And then lastly, apply credits if companies' risk profiles materially change to a low exposure or compliance with carrier filings. If I'm looking at a prospect, in some instances our captives have minimum premiums. And let's just use $250,000 for example. We may have a captive that has a $250,000 minimum to get in. The guy's paying $400,000 in the open marketplace, but he has no losses. Joe comes in and he says it's $180,000 is what your premium should be. Well, we're gonna have to credit that up because that group has said we are not gonna allow people to come in until we have met X dollars, okay? Some of our captives even control how low you can go. One of the captive I manage, we set a minimum at $150,000. 08, 09, when the exposure basis went in the tank, guys were struggling, we dropped that minimum to 110. And there was a lot of logic behind what we did, but again, we can gross things up or maybe even down to do that. The last thing that we may have to apply credits to is AIG, is one of the fronters that we use, and if they can't produce a policy, a legal policy, we may have to adjust the loss pick to be able to produce the legal policy in those states.
With the filed and approved rates on file, right?
Exactly. So again, at the end of the day, the actuary is going to give us the benchmark of what we want to do, but we still have to stay compliant. So those are some of the different discussions we have and determine the policies. When you go over to the renewal side of the equation, now you start looking at it from a little bit of a more global standpoint. And the big thing that we look at for this, as Joe kind of alluded to, is how much risk sharing are you causing or absorbing? Are you having more losses, and when did those losses come in? So some of the aspects that you're going to look at is everybody knows, we've got the actuary here, he'll tell you IBNR is real, and I agree with him. There's tails. A lot of the times it takes a period of time before things happen. So you'll have a member say, well, wait a second. How come his 4th year and his 3rd year are crushing us with risk sharing and we didn't do anything about it? Well, it may not have developed until 2 or 3 years down the path, so it takes some time, as Joe said, to develop that. We may increase his loss pick because we see some things in that risk sharing area outside of the actuary. It says, hey, we need to balance this out quicker to be fair to the membership. Okay, so we're looking at different aspects there. Carrier concerns with an individual's member excess claim risk. We may look at AIG and they may say with this type of auto risk, it's a little bit outside of the norm for what we think this group is made up of, and it may be an acquisition or something. So they may come back and say, hey, we think you need to raise the funding overall because you guys are taking on a lot more risk. They could even go as far as to say, and actually we want to add more reinsurance up here because we think there's more risk. If you look at the other one, review individual member lines of coverage for poor trends and adjust properly. You might have somebody with auto who's having a bunch of accidents. You might have somebody in the GL side that's having a bunch of slips and falls. Again, some of these are the way you can positively and negatively impact things a little bit out of the stats. And really the idea is to make sure you have more of a level trend. The worst thing you can do is walk into a group and have big risk sharing, big risk sharing, big risk sharing, big risk sharing, and nothing's happening because Joe and his statistics haven't caught up yet. So again, as he said, with a 5-year window, you get a little play, but at some point you have to adjust that timing to make it work. And the last piece of it that's really more of where this all comes down to is applied credits based on safety measures having a big impact. So if you have somebody that all of a sudden spent a bunch of money and did a return to work program, did a drug testing program or whatever, you may look at what those losses are over the 12 and 18 month window, and if you see a dip, you might credit that A fund and say, you know what, you've invested a bunch of money and it's kind of a quick quo pro. I'll help you out with your premiums to make sure you continue to invest your dollars the right way. So you start to predict that things are going to go down because of the aspects that you're putting in. Trucking, and the trucking captive, you've seen guys put cameras in. I think one of the individuals talked about cameras where he has it front facing and outward facing. You start to see that that does have a material impact on changing what those losses are. So again, if a guy's going to invest $50,000, he's going to want to see some of that recouped through his premium, so we can go ahead and offset that.
So do we want to talk about the X factor?
Sure.
I find it interesting. First, I'm an actuary. I'm bound by professional guidelines, standards. I don't want people taking the initials away from the end of my name. So I cannot do anything arbitrary just because I think it might happen. But over a lot of years, what we have found with these group captives is that from the time a new member joins, after they've been in, 3, 4, 5 years, in the aggregate, the experience for the entire captive improves significantly.
Right.
Because now they're doing everything according to the way the program works: safety, loss control, prompt reporting, attention to claims, and so on and so on. And we know that phenomenon is very real. You want to address that?
Yeah, so what ends up happening, it's kind of a unique thing. He was talking about trend factors. So when you're out in the industry and you start bringing an account in, you get stuck with the 5 years of the trend factors for the particular state or whatever you're in. And historically, what you're going to see if you truly match everything up, once you've been in the captive for 5 years, generally you will see your premium go down because now you're engaged, right? It's your money. If I spend it, I don't get it back. If I don't spend it, I get a great dividend. So ultimately what you see is there's about a 20% difference between the trend factors in the industry versus our normal group captives, which means just by being in the captive for 5 years, if you perform okay, you're going to see a 20% reduction in your premium because of the group as a whole doing better. Okay, the different things that we do, managing the claims and whatnot. So if Joe sat and put up industry average and captive averages, the captive performs substantially better. So the big joke, I'm obviously a salesman. I go out and I sell this to a lot of people, and a lot of people will ask me the question, well, Jim, if you're so smart and you can make so much money in these captives, why hasn't AIG hired you? Why hasn't the Hartford and Zurich hired? If you can make all this, we talked about Captive Resources giving back $1 billion. How come? And what I would tell you is a couple of
In
things.
dividends.
In dividends.
Since inception.
We use the same actuary for all of our captives. When we look at an underwriter, we have one underwriter for an entire group captive. So one of the problems I've always seen in the industry is, and I'll pick on Mark Benz because he's here from AIG, he has thousands of underwriters throughout the country, and each one of them looks at a risk differently. So he may give it this credit, you may give it another credit, you may say you don't want it. But at the end of the day, there's an anomaly there because each person's looking at it differently, so you see how it bounces all over the place. When I deal with his one underwriter, Jason Height, who works on a $100 million program, when he says no, it doesn't matter if I'm in California, Texas, or Florida. If I bring that same risk to it, he's going to say no again. So what you start to get is you get continuity. You get everything that you're bringing together, same like-minded good risk. So having that individuals using Joe on a consistent basis. So what you will see is we don't jump actuaries, we don't jump fronting carriers, we don't jump people, and you have a lot of really good data. And I'll give Joe credit. When you have a lot of good data, the predictability of what your captive is going to look like in the 3, 4, 5 year window comes out to be pretty close to what he's predicted.
So we've got about 5 minutes left. Questions from the audience?
Who wants ice cream? Go ahead.
When I think about, the experience of a member, and typically what I've heard is after 3 to 5 years, once that member is in the pool, the results get better. So obviously the first 3 to 5, the first group, maybe not so good, and it really is experimental to that point. What about retrospective, almost an introductory period for these folks that come in for the first few years? So you introduce them, you give them a fair price because it's retro rated, and for work comp, 3 to 5 is probably a good place to be anyway. And then after that, once you've got the experience and the membership sees how well this company is performing, if they want to accept them, then they become a full on board accepted member. Does any of that go on?
Talk about assessments.
Yeah, I mean, you're protected in the captive on a frequency basis because of the accessibility and things of that nature. The example I'll give you is in one of my programs, guy was running a tow truck company in California, paying $900,000 in comp premium when he came in. And again, he was doing all the right things. Now, remind you, we're not just every account. I would say of all the accounts that come in to Captive Resources, we might only quote 30% of what we look at. And we probably write about, of the 30%, we probably write 90% of those because we know they fit. So we know what the model really needs to be. So I think you're looking at it from a standpoint, is it a bad risk or is it a good risk? And we feel we're grabbing more of the low-hanging fruit, the really good risks. But this example was, he was at $900,000, fast forward 6 years, his premium was about $425,000. So the other thing that these guys look at is they don't care about mods, they don't care about state rates, they don't care about anything. If I control my losses, I can get my premium as low as possible. And the biggest misnomer in all of captives isn't that you get dividends. We like to say anytime you give money back, it's a cool thing, right? I'd love to hand $1 billion out to people and say, this is what we did for you. That's not the goal. The goal is to get your premium as low as physically possible and the dividend that you get later. But the catch to that whole thing goes from 900 to 450. His company grew by another 50% in that time. So that's how powerful this can be if you're managing it. So I would tell you generally, the first, second, and third year, they perform outstanding because now management, the owner, is so engaged and he knows if I don't have a claim, So we always talk about safety has to come from the top down. I mean, Andy Johnson, our head of safety, it's all about if the owner buys in. Well, when he writes a check and there's 600 grand sitting in a bank account that if he doesn't spend, he gets it, you can imagine there's a tremendous amount of pressure coming from the top down to be safe now.
Could you mention RCA scores? And the other,
Yep.
in my mind, fascinating dynamic with these groups is when they get together. And even though their financials are protected,
Yeah, coded.
the amount of peer pressure and desire to be better than their partner, how that
Yeah.
comes into play.
Yeah, we do risk safety assessment scores every year on everybody in the captive, and it's shared with the entire group. And so what you see is we have different matrices and guidelines of what you have to be able to perform by. If you fall below that, you get put on a watch list, and then we may give you extra safety services, but, you know, we do different things. And if you don't perform over a period of time, you can be asked to leave. But again, we give out awards. I give the example, a young guy, he's an older guy, one of my captives, had gotten an award 4 years in a row for being safe. And he was so mad, he wasn't gonna get an award in the captive that year. And I said, well, you're getting a $300,000 dividend. I can give you a piece of paper if you wanna give me the $300,000 dividend back. But that's what he's talking about. They're so competitive. And when you got the best of the best in the room, it just raises the bar constantly. I mean, you get an 85 on something, you think you're doing great, and you're at that lower third, it's gonna force you as a company, as an owner, to say, we gotta get better. The other thing that's nice about it is when you're sitting in a like room like this, and everybody's got the same safety goals, it's neat. I can walk over to you and say, hey man, how did you get this done? And the sharing of information, because at the end of the day, the other thing our groups fully understand, if he messes up and I didn't help him, I could end up having to pay some of that claim. So that commingling of risk sharing that we talked about for the tax deductibility also helps. Yes, sir.
One more question.
Sure.
Piggybacking on this, isn't your frequency fund really designed as a incurred loss retro? And so so you have that variability, so you get the immediate return. If you have a good year, you get the immediate return on those efforts.
Yeah, it can be considered like an incurred loss retro. The difference is you pay 100% of the premium in. So sometimes on the incurred, you're talking incurred versus paid. So you can get that. There is a maximum. You do have the upward ability if you're not performing that lower
You're
leg.
going to pay in a
Right.
certain amount. If you go over, you're going to pay in more. If you go under, you're going to get back.
The difference between the retro and what we do is that severity layer. So one bad claim can't smoke you on. Like an incurred retro, you have one bad claim, you can hit both sides real quick.
Incurred retro with
A cap. Yep, a cap on the minimal claims, exactly. The big difference is ours is fully tax deductible, and we can get into all those fun things too, which there's a bunch of smarter people here with words like KPMG in front of them than me, so I'd have you have that conversation with them.
All right, thank you so much for your attention. Jim and I will be around if you have more questions, and if you want to find me tonight on the beach, I'll be at the cigar bar. Thank you.